It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor of Archaeology Howard Williams, interviewing Professor of Archaeology Howard Williams, with special guests Archaeosoup and author Michelle Franklin.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We have a very special guest today. Two special guests, in fact, but one guest you already know, Mark from Archaeosoup. But the very special guest, because this is his first time being here, is Professor Archaeologist Howard Williams, TM. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello.
Howard, for those who don't know you and your delightful channel on TikTok, will you please introduce yourself and tell people what you do?
Okay, hello everybody. I am a professor of archaeology in the UK, and I blog and vlog as Archaeodeath.
And Mark and I are his Archaeodeathlings, or two of his Archaeodeathlings, I should say.
Yes.
But you have many Archaeodeathlings now, which is quite nice.
Yes, it's
We
a nice
will follow
healthy number.
him.
No, I don't know who they all are. Most of them probably bots paid for by myself to make myself look popular.
I don't think you could do that on TikTok, honestly.
Well, they do keep trying to sell me promoting videos, but I don't bother, you know. They either go well or they don't, you know.
Yeah, and it's often the ones you don't care about that do the best, which is
Exactly. You can't predict. If I do one random, like I did a silly one, Monty Python sketch. And
oh, that was the best though. It was so good. I love it so much.
I literally had 10 minutes before I had to do something else, and I just run down the corridor and did a quick edit. It just I'm most proud of the end bit where I go, hey.
I love that one. My favorite one that you've ever done was the one on Archaeodeath, where you're continuously running down the same hallway. I don't know how you remembered what you were saying, because obviously you had to pause, run back, and then continue what you were saying.
I might do another running one in a little while. Yeah,
I need to it's so good.
The running Archaeodeath.
I love it because you just like randomly started jogging, and then after a while, just like ripping through the. But I love it. I think that that's the kind of, TikTok has a lot of garbage, but I think that's the kind of educational creativity that TikTok really allows for, and people pay attention and they learn something that way. And I mean, I know everything nowadays is like 5-second sound bites or 11-second sound bites. But if you can teach somebody something in that time, and I think that that's what both you and Mark are really good at. You're very good at teaching somebody something in a very short amount of time and and keeping their attention, which apparently I can't do. I can't keep attention too long because 30 seconds is too long.
And you do great content, and it's people will find you. That's what I always say about social media. It's not about numbers of followers, or numbers of interaction. It's about having your niche and keep going with it. I think that's my view. It's nice to have followers, but equally I don't pin anything on it. It's just about being able to share an expertise so people know where to go if they at a particular moment want something on something. I think that's really important for academics and generally learned boffins of all nerdy types.
And I think that's how I found you eventually, like a year ago. I think I was looking for something specifically about Pictish archaeology, and lo and behold, you have a whole playlist on Pictish archaeology. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, specifically Norse, Saxon, and Pictish archaeology. A little bit about their history also. Mark has decided to keep a scoreboard, so we'll see how many questions we can get through. No pressure at all. Absolutely not. So question the first. I think this is a really important, let's just get established, because I think this is something that a lot of people do ask. And I think it's important to understand what this word means. So what did the Vikings call themselves? Is Viking or just a verb, or is it a noun? My favorite definition of this that is given in one dictionary that I have is opportunistic seafaring adventurer.
Well, that's a nice one. I like that.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Mark, or shall I have a stab?
This is the problem, you see, is that you are the professor here. So I think I would say when I was working at the Orvik Center, we would say that to go Vikinger was an activity. Some people say it's a profession. I'm not sure you could qualify it as a job per se. And we would call people Norse, generally speaking. But also I think that encapsulates a linguistic and cultural block really as well, and a series of associations. So I'm intrigued to hear more.
Okay, so this is a topic I've addressed on my TikTok, and some of my most popular videos have been about the names people use for themselves in the early Middle Ages, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings. For the Viking term, we have to remember this is largely in modern use a construction of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. That our term Vikings, Viking Age, Viking world, Vikings is used very loosely, broadly in the modern world, but people want to know what the Vikings call themselves. So most of the time, I think people would refer to themselves by their kin group, by their geographical, regional place of origin when they needed to describe where they were from other people. The term Vikings would have been perhaps more restricted, and as we've heard, would have referred to seafaring venturers. And I think we see a lot of misinformation and confusion over this because the term evolved, and we're not really sure how common or how widely it was used in the early Middle Ages itself, but we do think that the consensus is that it refers to seagoing raiders or traders. And what I always try to explain on TikTok to TikTok audiences is that it's not an ethnicity or a race or a single culture, that we all agree, but some people get confused on that point. But equally, a lot of people, as Mark rightly pointed out, this obsession to debunk that, people then revert to another set of misinformation, which is that it was a job or an occupation, which at one level is a helpful way of countering that other misconception. Another level, the terms occupation, job have their own baggage in modern culture. It's this idea of, well, what's your job for the summer? Well, I'm going off on some Viking. I'm going to be a Viking, and it's a 6-month contract, 0 hours, but the perks, are quite extensive. It gives people a whole, we're talking about. So and many of these individual expeditions may have been simultaneously for raiding and trading when they were small scale. And of course, if we only refer to, in my opinion, as academics, if we only restrict the use of the term Viking to that type of activity alone, rather than a broader geopolitical, cultural phenomenon, then we're actually causing as much confusion as we're solving, because most people understand the term Viking to refer to a period, a region that isn't just about Scandinavians and Norse speakers, but is about a diaspora, a movement of people, an economic social network of trading and military activities, all of which we package in this big bubble as Viking. But if we say, oh no, like there's nobody at Jorvik in the representations in that visitor center that would be a Viking in that very narrow sense. And so you end up creating more problems than you solve, in my opinion. So to answer your question, in the early Middle Ages, most people would refer to themselves by family name or by political grouping or geographical grouping. The term Viking probably originates as a seaborne raider or seaboard raiders and traders. And I don't think people distinguish quite as clearly as we do now between the two. And the other point I want to say is there's a great academic drive to call them pirates. And again, this is another term that is absolutely academics digging their own grave for themselves, or creating problems for us to mess up, us more public facing scholars to then pick up the pieces of. Because pirates, while it does give you that sense of not only seaborne, but based on deliberate strategies of exploitation and raiding. There's a lot of parallels with other periods and places from the modern day. That there's a whole series of racialized ethnic baggage with the term pirates. In the modern world, we tend to think of Somalia. We tend to think of that has its connotations. In terms of Disney, we have our Jack Sparrow images, and in some ways there's a positive conversations to be had there of educating people and saying, oh yeah, Vikings were a bit like pirates, and you go, oh, what do you mean by that? And then you can have a conversation. But it's one of those labels I think is actually more of a hindrance than a help. So I think I totally agree with Mark. Seaborne venturers that could be raiding or trading, but if we start to only use the term to refer to those groups in the early Middle Ages, it's as good as useless. And calling them pirates is a rubbish, anachronistic term. And I prefer to talk about the Vikings in the modern sense as a broader socio-economic network and a political set of phenomena that spanned Scandinavia, all the way to the Russian and Ukrainian river systems and beyond, and across the North Atlantic and to the, down the west coast of Europe. So we've got those overlapping significances in the modern day.
So for those who don't know, who would you group into the group of Viking?
Well, I mean, if you do, this is the thing, almost every academic book will use it as a book title and then immediately in the introduction explain, that's not what we're talking about. So the Vikings, the Viking world, and they'll always have a section. Some of them are better than others. I was a bit despairing of a
It's
Richter's
the same
book.
with Celts, actually, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
Yeah.
always,
yeah.
the
No,
opening
Celts.
paragraph is always, well, we're going to use this word, but yeah.
So in many ways, if you're talking about the Viking period, then you can talk about almost anybody as being part of the Viking world. You can talk about Arabs, the Caliphate. You can talk about the Byzantine world, the Eastern Roman Empire as it extends onwards as part of the Viking world. You can talk about the Khazars. You can talk about the Balts, the Finns, the Slavs. You can talk about the Sami. You can talk about the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, the Picts, the Scots, all as part of that Viking world, and the Welsh even. Although the Welsh, the Cambro-Norse is a term that occasionally rears its ugly head in the literature, referring to the interactions of Wales with the Viking world, particularly around the crinkly edge bits. But my point is, almost everywhere you can about the Franks, Spain, Brittany. So in one level, it's a very loose term, and that's a good thing. But in terms of the peoples we tend to refer to as the Viking, the core of the Viking world, we're looking at the modern nation, the Nordic countries, and areas that are heavily settled by Scandinavians, such as modern day Russia and Ukraine in the east, parts of Poland on the coast, maybe parts of Estonia, and also Finland. And then to the west, you can have Iceland, Greenland, these islands, whatever we like to call them, the British Isles or the Anglo-Celtic archipelago. Let's not go there. And then Normandy, maybe, that would be the core Viking world, areas heavily influenced by military and settlement activities of the Scandinavians.
When often of a morning, you would have, again, going back to Jorvik, you'd have a queue outside of people waiting to come in. And you always knew when it was typically the Norwegians. The Danes and the Swedes were much less like this. But the Norwegians would be like, hello, we're the real Vikings. We're here to see your museum. And it'd be like, oh, for crying out loud. And then we joke, obviously, we go, well, no, you're not, because you stayed at home. And then from there, like, it depends on how grumpy we were, but they loved it. They loved being abused by us. It was a fantastic job.
That's a great one. Fantastic.
But that's the point, isn't it? Technically speaking, depending on how you define it, yeah, it becomes really hard to actually pin it down. Oops.
Well, this is simultaneously why we need to counter people in the modern day who live in Canada or the US or Mexico.
Don't get me started in this. I didn't do anything.
who claim Viking as an identity and label, but equally I'm pushing back against Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes who say, "Oh, we're the real Viking." No, you're not. Actually, there's probably more legitimate descendants of Vikings in Yorkshire and Cumbria than there are in the whole of Scandinavia.
Precisely.
If you want to get into arguments about biological stuff, which I don't, but I'm just saying, there's a
if we really
rhetorical
didn't
pushback.
like them, we'd be like, "You're a farmer."
Yeah. Stay-at-home sheep farmer,
Exactly.
But they kept people from dying, whereas the other ones caused people to die.
Nothing wrong with being a farmer, exactly. Yeah.
But I think his point is that every nation claims the Vikings as protagonists or antagonists or a bit of both. And the other power of the Vikings is everyone likes to pretend there's a story arc of redemption into Christian civilization from the Viking Age, whether they like to think of themselves as Christian or pagan. So there's a whole series of ways in which people assign to the Vikings as enemies or friends or ancestors or enemies of your ancestors. Even if you don't. Even if your narrative is, well, us Cornish, we saw off the Vikings, or us Welsh, we kicked Viking butt at Buttington or wherever it may be. These are narratives that sounded good, actually. No, these are the kind of narratives that are identity forming in the modern world. But of course, we have to be very, in jest, it's fine. But people take it way too seriously, shall we say?
Yeah. Mark and I had this conversation about Celts when we talked about things like St. Patrick. And it's exactly the same. People say I'm Celtic. No, you're not really. You're not.
Mm.
They're gone. They've been gone. Now we talk about the term Celtic really only in terms of the languages, because those are the extant languages. But the idea of the Celts are gone. We had this conversation as well with Professor Ronald Hutton when we were talking about the Gudenstrup cauldron,
Oh,
which,
yes.
yeah, which is not a Celtic piece, but
100% Celtic. It's oozing Celt.
but you will see it plastered on
Yeah,
every
yeah.
textbook about the Celts, it's not even a Latene piece, it's not even Celtic, but because it has been associated with Cernunnos, everybody thinks that this is a Celtic piece. It's not, it's a Black Sea
Well,
piece.
a lot of people get pissed off when I point out that Viking art is largely a mashup of, you know, Carolingian, Anglo-Saxon, insular more broadly, you know.
Hold it, Howard, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna get
Oh,
to
right, sorry.
that.
Well, I
Edit
was
that
just
bit
about,
out.
I was just about to say we're on what, question 1 of 20.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Okay,
should shut
yeah,
up.
yeah.
No, we will get to that though. That is very
Have we
important.
got points yet?
Well, I gave you a point because, you know.
You got a point too.
Well, yeah, okay, I'll give.
I think you should get a point for that one, Mark. Okay,
Everyone
so,
should get a point.
second question. This is a many-part question. Why do people think that the Picts were painted? Is it only because of the Romans? Do we actually have any evidence that they were painted or tattooed? If so, was it woad or charcoal? What did the Picts call themselves?
Again, I'm not a Pictish. Sorry, do you want to go first, Mark?
No, go ahead.
I'm not a Pictish expert, but my reading of the latest literature is that we have no direct evidence from visual representation or archaeology that the Picts painted or tattooed themselves. Tattooing traditions are widespread in many cultures. Painting bodies at different times is not unknown, but we don't really know from archaeological sources. The only sources of naming we have from the contemporary period are that they're called the Picts by the Romans, and that this could be a accurate ethnographic description of that nobody else did it and these people did, so we'll call them the painted ones. Or it could be a much more looser or random nickname that was picked up at as this is where I'm in bad company here. I'm doing it without even thinking. That was picked up and stuck as a motif. So the Picti is a term that we can't know how widely it was used, but by the writings of the Venerable Bede in the early 8th century, from a Northumbrian perspective, where there's many things we can say bad about the Venerable Bede, but we can say that at least geographically he was in the right kind of environment to say something about the Picts, and he described them as one of the 4, you know, group tribes of Britain, one of the 4 peoples of Britain, and therefore I think it has some legitimacy to see that by the 8th century they were perceived as different linguistically and perhaps culturally from the Gaels and the Irish and the Scotty from the is what I meant, and the Cumbrians, the Cymric peoples, the British peoples, and the Anglo-Saxons. Of course, he would say the the English. So you know, he sees them as a major political cultural grouping to his north. We don't know what they called themselves. Obviously, there's various polities and local groups whose names come and go in our sources, but I don't think for many of these early medieval peoples, we don't know what they called themselves.
Eumenius was the first person who wrote the word Pict in I think it was 297 AD. There you go, 297 AD.
It's the very end of the 3rd century.
Yeah. And it really just is the Greek for picture. That's about it. Foster in 1996, he wrote that much ink has been spilt over what the ancient writers meant by the Picts, as you said. So as you said, it's a generic term for people of the north. That's about it. The Caesar was the one who first mentioned vitrum as them like using vitrum or woad on themselves. But I mean, there were upper class Romans talked about how Roman soldiers were tattooed and how this was the thing that upper class Roman society did not do. And even was it Vegetius in his Epitoma talks about how Romans adopted the practice of tattooing around the time for themselves. We don't know if this is something that the army did to themselves or if this is something that was done to soldiers to keep them from deserting. So this way they would be able to know who deserted. But it turns woad being used Probably
I didn't
not.
really answer that. I mean, why not? But no, we don't know.
Yeah, we have
But it's
no
become a
idea.
thing, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
a
well,
lot of ink has been spilt on tattooing and painting.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's
Well,
why I put it in there.
a lot of pigment has been spilled. But the thing is,
Um,
what I would say, I guess, is that I've always, not always, but I've come to the feeling that the association with woad is also because there was a lot of trade in woad.
mm.
So woad was coming down, we know, through a very permeable trade border of Hadrian's Wall into the empire, and it was one of the bigger exports from Britain: salt, lead, wool, woad. You know, these were things which I think sea salt in particular, and gold and tin, and so maybe it could be one of those things where it becomes an association. So like today, I guess it's not quite a racist association or an unhelpful one, but it's one that you might think of. For example, an equivalent might be that the idea that everyone in Canada, Michelle, is constantly guzzling maple syrup, for
We do,
example.
though.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Exactly. And
I
that
mean,
maybe
it's often said that all roads lead to Rome. So
oh God. And this is what it's like. This is what it's like, for you. I'm so sorry,
This is what
Michelle.
archaeologists really do all day when they're not in the pit. They just go,
Yeah,
how can we
imagine
make
the
the
pain of my students having to listen to this
yeah,
rubbish.
yeah,
That's
yeah. How
okay.
can
They
we,
get a degree at the end of it. I subject myself to the
Some of them pass,
structure.
yeah, how can we hurt people? But or maybe because and maybe even to take it a step further, because Canadians are seen as very friendly
We're not.
compared to the stereotype is being very friendly.
We just keep mean
Um,
things to ourselves, Mark.
exactly. That's the British for polite. That's like,
That's where we get it from.
but these associations can be sort of mixed up together, and then in your head you come up with this idea of a Mountie. You could argue that that's some sort of polite warrior, stereotype.
I think a
And
lot of that has to
you
do
know,
with Dudley Do Right. And
yes,
yeah.
yeah, but again, I did in that sense, a lot of it might have to do with with your man writing it down at the end of the 3rd century. So
Mhm.
it's I find it interesting that if it's and the what I find more interesting, not to ramble on, is how it relates to modern Scotland. Though an awful lot of people rush to buy into this idea of being, and we've talked about this previously in terms of Celticism, but this idea of being almost anti-civilized. So not that you're not civilized, but a bit like an anti-hero. You're not English.
Hmm.
You're anti-civilized, and I don't think that's necessarily healthy actually for you.
What do you mean? What do you mean? If people didn't wear woad in Braveheart times?
No, exactly, and so I think Picts and Pictishness has a lot of modern psychological implications, definitely.
So, third question. Can you please talk about the Frank's casket? What was it for? Who made it? And what is in it?
Oh, because I failed and it's still in my drafts, which then when I reinstalled TikTok has been omitted. So you did ask me about this. I think you did, and I failed to give you a video. Shame on me. So you finally get me on this. Okay. So the Frank's casket is called the Frank's casket because of the mid-19th century creator of the British Museum, Augustus W. Franks, if I remember his name right, and he acquired it from France, but it's nothing to do with the Franks. So
Mm.
it is a whalebone casket, dating, I think it'd be fair to say, to the 8th century. I don't want to be pinned down too much on that. To the 8th century. So in England, we'd call that the Middle Anglo-Saxon period. So it's before the Viking Age, at a time where there are Christian kingdoms and who have a literate clergy and monks and monasteries, minster churches. We have far-flung trading contacts, and it fits into that world of territorial kingdoms, what's often cringeworthily called the heptarchy of 7 kingdoms. But the big ones include Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, right? So it's from that time of the Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before the Viking Age. And it is thought may have been actually a special box gifted to royalty as a relic to contain reliquaries. So it may have been a box to contain holy relics that have now been lost. And it's famous because its panels depict a range of different, really amazing, some of them unique scenes that pertain to classical mythology and history, or biblical history, as part of that too, and scenes that have been crudely called of Germanic origin or Germanic origin myths or stories. And of course, the most famous ones are the sacking of Jerusalem is depicted.
On the back, I
Romulus
think.
Pardon?
On the back, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also have a scene that seems to depict a really sort of juxtaposition of the adoration of the Magi, of the three wise men or kings, bringing gifts to the Christ child in the manger in modern parlance, and next to it you've got the giving of cursed gifts of the Germanic hero, anti-hero, I think more like Smith, Wayland, making jewels from the bones of the slain king's sons and intoxicating and seducing the king's daughter. And so you have this really evocative, and it's often seen as a blending of cultures. I think that's a really I won't get into the reason why that's wrong, but it's showing a world that is intact. It's drawing on that Christian and Roman past, as well as connecting into stories of the northern world more broadly. And clearly, in an elite Christian world, these pagan stories were clearly, well known and part of the martial aristocratic ideology and storytelling culture the kings would understand alongside those Christian and Roman sources. So it's an object that's famous because it shows that blending and an interaction of Middle Anglo-Saxon England's kingdoms with these many inherited and living traditions. I think that's the simplest way of describing this monument, but this object. But the other thing is, it's not just made from any kind of material; it's made from whalebone. So it's and it has upon it old English runes that describe the and Latin runes. Sorry, doesn't it?
Yes, it has Latin on it. Yes.
Describe its origins as a first-person object. It's a speaking object, so it describes itself as being made of a sea monster's bones. So it's a really evocative object. It's one of these speaking objects of the early Middle Ages that tells you, as a reader or if someone's reading it out, it tells you of whence it came. So, and if it was intended to contain holy relics of some form, and there's been various speculations of what it may have contained, and it was being given as a gift, there's a double power to the fact that it was made from the bones of a sea monster, from a whale, that it was actually, and it's telling you that's part of this gift, the gift giving is such an integral part of the scenes upon it. So it's a really amazing object, and I can't expound much further than that from memory, but I think it's a really amazing object. It's on display in the British Museum. So it's one of the key prized objects of the British Museum that isn't looted in the same way as many objects. And it is a really fantastic object if you're in London and you can get to see it.
There's a wonderful copy here in the Great North Museum in Newcastle, which is where I first saw it. And one of my favorite things about it, whenever so a couple of times now I've taken small school groups through the museum and we've stopped and looked at it, is that with a basic sort of Frisian rune set, you can actually read where the Magi are labeled MAGI on the front of the box. It's actually quite cool. And
that's amazing.
And I think the only thing I would add to what Howard said there is that it's a box that speaks of confidence about time and place. When people previously had described the Dark Ages, this is a little glowing, geographically aware, interconnected statement, and crucially, it makes that connection to the classical world. This is something which hopefully our viewer at home may have considered before, but we call these the Middle Ages because they connect to the classical world they consider themselves, the early modern considered it to be midway between them and the Iron Age and Romans and so on and so forth. So for people in the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages, the continuation of power through the Roman Church, through people like Charlemagne, and in the Saxon kingdoms, and connections across Europe was crucial. And this box really encapsulates that in a very very intricate and beautiful way.
And if I can add something that I forgot to say, is that you've got to remember that the story of Wayland the Smith is only known from the Poetic Edda, so from 13th century Icelandic sources, and then later Friedrich Saga and other later medieval parables. And other than that, until recently, I should say, only conclusive, early medieval object to depict that story is the 8th century Frank's casket. And if you're a cynic like me, who thinks, oh, we're constantly back projecting stories from the 13th, 14th century onto earlier times, they didn't know them, and we do have to be cautious. But this is an object that shows that sometimes we should, even if the story had different iterations, different meanings, different connotations. And then we have it in the Viking Age. We have 10th century carved stone monuments with Wayland upon them. And then we have now a wonderful possible horse harness piece from Upokra in southern Sweden, historic in Scania. We have that depicts the flying figure of Wayland or Volander. We have at least, it really, what's amazing about the object is it not only shows us the later perpetuation of biblical and Roman legendary sources, but it shows we can push back these sources otherwise we only know about from over half a millennium later.
Yeah, that is really amazing. It is really important to have that. I mean, a lot of people take the sagas as gospel, and we have to remember that they're written hundreds of years after the any kind of event that that actually took place, and they're also Christianized as well. So we have to keep that in mind. Mark, you were going to say something?
I was going to say something very silly. I was just going to say, then of course now we have Scandi Noir and Wallander.
I was gonna go on about Kenneth Branagh, but then I thought, no, don't do it, Howard.
No,
leave that one.
No, skipping ahead. Next question. If we have the Irminbu helmet, why do you think we don't have any other Viking helmets intact?
We do.
Which ones?
There's one in North Yorkshire.
I
have featured this. I forgot what it's called, but for a long time it was thought of as being a Victorian stage prop.
Yeah, so bad.
And actually one of my close mentors, Chris Capel, was the person to do the study on it.
Wow.
And he's established that this was iron that had been produced in the right time period, and it may well have been repaired and bits, so on and so forth over time. But actually, it is the second confirmed Viking Age helmet, which is, in that sense, it's like Buzz Aldrin. It's not, it's not the name that people are going to remember. But the thing I find most interesting about it, because obviously you have the image of gleaming, polished helmets from stories like Beowulf, and this idea that things are, in that story in particular, it's highlighted specifically when treasure hasn't been looked after because it's not shining. So this idea is that you look after the material that is made of metal that's in your possession. And in the case of the Irminbu helmet, we have this sort of it's like a spangle helm, so that you got these sort of eyeglasses almost impression. But the one in the museum in North Yorkshire is ugly. It's ugly as sin, and that's the point. I think it really shows that there are different levels of helmet.
Yes.
There are different use cases. There are different abilities to repair and to upkeep your gear.
Yes.
But also the reason why we only have two, as far as my opinion anyway, is that it's metal. Metal is useful, and it can be used to turn into a farming implement if you're on hard times. It can be turned into a chandelier and then turned into a fork. So it's it's interesting. And if nothing else, I've been reminded now that I need to share my Frank's casket and the second Viking helmet videos on TikTok. But anyway, so Howard, I didn't mean to dive in there ahead of you.
No.
Um,
I want to put some context because Mark has already eloquently from the whole Viking world. We only have 2 helmets, and that seems really shocking. And if you're gonna you're gonna say without any context, that shows that Vikings didn't wear many helmets, right?
mm,
But I think you've got to remember, firstly, this was a culture of reuse, like and recycling. It was a society where higher status items would be curated. So you melt them down or you keep them and just hand them down. And the other thing people forget about Viking burial practice, which is the only context where we get one of the main contexts where we get a lot of weaponry, is it was just because we find stuff in those graves doesn't mean they were dressing people as in life. And I think
mm,
some of the more prized objects, like various types of armor, would not going into these graves. So the funerals are selective processes, and a lot of those items are being taken else. Another kind of funerary recycling. So there's the recycling in life, but there's also recycling in death. That things are being brought back. Remember that many of these societies are cremating their dead. Many of these communities are using burning the dead. And despite it being a bit of a trope that is we can debunk, people may have even been burning on water in some circumstances, but mainly on land. And therefore we're losing a lot. We probably have more bits of helmet, but we just haven't identified them. And
yeah.
particularly if the helmet is becoming more practical and most helmets are like the Yarm helmet rather than the Yermanbu or Germanbu helmet,
Yeah.
then we're in a fragmentary state. It's not going to be recognizable as if it doesn't have these wonderful presbleche ornaments of the Vendel and Valsgärde and Sutton Hoo helmets of earlier centuries. If you're not wearing it as a high status object, it's just going to be iron. And the other point it's really important to say is you can have helmets that are made out of simply caps of iron or not iron at all. You can have leather caps. There's various other things. I mean, of all the bogus leather armor we see in TV shows, that we can debunk that. But probably one piece of kit you might want to have is a leather cap. I don't know. My point is that there's lots of options for headgear in the Viking Age. I think helmets of some form were probably widespread, if not ubiquitous. It's just that very few survive because our archaeological record is very selective. Both the choices of past people about where and how to discard things, and then how things survive.
It's the Preston Park Museum near in Teesside, actually. Sorry, so Stockton on Tees, and yes, it's the Yarm helmet. So we actually once, just by happenstance, were driving past it on the way home, and I went, "Oh, we need to go and see it." So we went to see the helmet, and it's the fact that bits of it are definitely missing. So there were sort of plates on the back where you can see a sort of a central band that was holding the plates in place, and one of the questions there is whether or not actually what you have there is something that's become a source of metal, and plates could be taken off to maybe patch up a bucket, not a bucket, but patch up a hole in something, maybe rivet something on. So yeah, it's interesting how they seem to run that gamut, don't they, Howard, between being prestige items, but also when it comes down to it, hardware that can and could and should be reused if necessary.
And I think we have to remember 2 other pieces of potential misinformation for people. Firstly, the Coppergate helmet is not Viking Age, even though the Coppergate site is mainly known for its Viking Age levels in York and is the basis of the York Visitor Centre. The Coppergate helmet, which is wonderful and on display at the Yorkshire Museum, was found on that dig, but it's pre-Viking. It's a Anglo-Saxon or Anglian helmet, whichever term you prefer, but it's pre-Viking. And the other, I think the other key piece of information you may be coming on to is we don't have any evidence of horned helmets as such. That's basically based on historic fiction illustrations and opera props from the 19th century. We've got that. So it's important to say that there are probably many different kinds of headgear, and we do have other, and a final piece of qualification is we actually do have other helmets represented on art from the Viking Age, and all of them are more simple nasal helms with a nose guard and a conical, and things like the Middleton stone from the 10th century in North Yorkshire has a representation of a helmeted person, which is probably a local lord. And so we have representations of helmets, which is another major strand of evidence to show that they did wear stuff on their head.
Next
one other
question.
thing.
Oh,
Can I say
go
one other
ahead.
thing? The other thing is, of course, people should know that the reason why lead characters in TV shows and films don't have helmets is because they're stupid, but also because no one would then recognize the actor. And that's the main reason why, that they always have suddenly, the last thing you'd want to be rid of is head protection, right?
Yeah, a lot of them do have some important to remember. A lot of them do have contracts that say they cannot cover their face because otherwise that's what they're known for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which you would know if you brought your son, Howard. If your son was with you today.
I know, little Grogu.
Poor Grogu. It's okay. He's probably sitting on Offa's Dyke by now.
He's off exploring, eating frogs.
So, who discovered the Lewis chessmen? Are they really Viking if they were found in Scotland and date to the 12th century?
A cow, I do believe, discovered the Lewis chessmen.
I forgot that actually, so
Uh,
I don't need a point for that. I admit to not having a point because I would have forgotten that. I
uh,
knew they're found on a beach, but in
Yeah.
Lewis,
yeah.
but I didn't know it was a cow that was
I
behind it.
seem to recall it was a cow.
Or is that a legend, Mark?
It's probably a legend, Michelle. I don't know if you saw this, but the other day, Michelle is often schooling us all in etymology, obviously. And I wrote, I do love to learn, but will I ever? And it's basically where I'm at with the cow. No, yeah, so and I think they count in so much as, I mean, lots of work has been done on them. In so, some people think now that they may represent named individuals, and so on and so forth, and the stereotype of the sort of the biting the shield, but in other ways, the shield shapes and so on and so forth evoke something that's not classically what you might think of as being, Scandinavian Iron Age. So I think they count in the same way that. Again, this is just a thought. I don't know to what extent I'm about to be sort of shouted down. They count as an extension in that sense of motifs of culture, maybe an echo possibly. But were it not for these ideas and these stories, then they probably wouldn't exist in the way that they do. I don't know. Is that maybe I'm being too fudgy here? Possibly. What do you think, Howard?
Well, I must admit, I've never thought about this. I forgot about the origins. I knew they were discovered on a beach, and I thought local people, obviously, like many archaeological finds, local people were the people that found them. But I couldn't remember any of the details, so I remain skeptical about the bovine dimension and just say local people found them. And
You weren't there, man. You weren't.
and that it was a good example of how so many of our archaeological finds rely on reliable, responsible reporting. Obviously, but that's, I can't remember the details. But the other point I would say is no, they don't count, and we've made them count by being obsessed by putting them in books about the Viking Age, and they count in the sense, but they do count. Nothing wrong with what Mark said, because they speak of that late Norse, North Atlantic world of walrus ivory trade. And we now have evidence, more recent work is showing that the Greenland colony was surviving on other things, but mainly on its international trade of walrus ivory. And the failing of that colony in the high Middle Ages into the later Middle Ages in increments may have been competition from the African ivory trade. And so I think what the Lewis chessmen are a beautiful example of that North Atlantic long distance trading relationships that were linking Iceland and Greenland to continent mainland Scandinavia, these islands, and Europe's trading networks. And they are beautiful carvings of that medieval feudal society that do echo earlier centuries and the art and so on. But there's this kind of double standard in academia that at one level we want to be, no, the Viking Age is a chronological period that starts in 793 and ends in 1066. Apart from the North Atlantic, which gets a free, gets a free pass to just talk about the late Norse period until whenever European settlers shove off, or so I kind of it's a bit of a weird, it's a kind of a bit of a weird one. And there is a double standard here that they get inserted into all of the the books on the Viking Age, even though they're not directly related to the Viking world, but they do speak, of course, as Mark said rightly, about the legacy of the settlement of the North Atlantic and the trading relationships that it spawned with Europe.
Do you think then that there's a, to sort of expand on this idea of an echo, do you think it's kind of like saying neoclassical isn't classical, but it wouldn't exist were it not for the classical world?
It's like saying that the sagas are Viking Age. You know, they
Yeah.
speak about the Viking Age, but they're not from the Viking Age.
No.
To deny any relationship with the Viking Age would be silly, but equally to pretend that they are Viking Age would be silly. So, you know, it's about understanding these are an evolution, cultural and economic and social evolution, and these artworks capture that very well. And it's just about, you know, when you're trying to, if you want to soundbite it, they're late Norse or medieval, and they speak of the trade connections and the societies that are the direct inheritors of the Viking diaspora.
So speaking of similar items,
Sorry, okay, yeah.
is the Birka crucifix really a depiction of Christ if it dates before the Christianization of the Vikings?
Is this an additional question, or does this count as a point? Or
Oh, this is the next question, but I can see both of you are going.
Okay, go on, Mark. You go first.
No. After you.
No. Okay, the Birka crucifix is now not unique. I think we've got a series of others that have been found across Scandinavia. I haven't kept up with the details, but they're part of a particularly mainland Scandinavian representation of a bound Christ rather than a crucified Christ, what we find on the famous late 10th century Yelling stone, the three-sided stone from Jutland, and it has been seen as an extension of a sort of a blurring of traditions between the sacrifice of Christ and the sacrifice or the killing of Balder. I'm not so sure. I don't know the details of the debates about that, to be honest with you. I would say that in the context of a major emporium or trade, a proto town, some people seem to be just calling Birka a town now. I always sort of thought it was best to call it a proto town or a trading settlement. A big, in that context, that hub of trade and exchange, where there was early attempts at Christian missionary activities in the 9th century that didn't go so well, and then Christianity was well known in the trading networks and the contacts of the Viking world. I think we see it as a Christian item. It doesn't mean the person who wore it was a Christian. There's a debate there. It doesn't mean that it was only seen in a Christian way, but it may have been a symbol of protection, a symbol of wealth and status and power and all the other things other amulets were. But certainly I think we have to see it as a representation of Christ. But would it have had other connotations? Could people have used it and circulated it with other stories attached? Of course. And I think in a polytheistic world system where Christ is just one more annoying god that you have to worry about, you know, I don't see why the label of it being a representation of Christ necessarily narrows down. And likewise, I have strong opinions that we're fixated because of the label of calling Thor's hammer pendants or Thor hammer rings or representations of Thor's hammer, as if that was the only possible inference of hammers in the Viking Age, and you know, and that Thor's hammer had only one single meaning within those stories. So you know, I think we have to be aware these symbols are circulating, they're being worn as personal items. I don't think they were just badges of faith. Look at me, I'm a bit of a Christian. Look at me, I'm a Thor. I'm a Thorite or Thorite. Thor. What do we call it?
I'm thorny.
Thorny. Well, whatever. I think it's a bit reductive to see these items as simply kind of modern badges of faith, you know, in that way.
Absolutely. And so one that I often would hear a lot about amongst my friends and colleagues in former jobs was things like the Fosse cross, and the idea that you can sort of hedge your bets depending on where you go. You know, depending on how you hold it, on how you see it, it could be pagan, it could be a hammer, it could be a cross. There's up here, there's a Saint Cuthbert, who has a cross associated with him and Durham Cathedral called Cuthbert's Cross, but it's also known as Thor's Cross because it's got like bulbous ends to it, and there's a little a garnet in the center, and so on and so forth.
Wonderful
And
drawing.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
good
thank
job,
you.
Mark.
A lot of people are, as you say, they're quite fixated on this because, again, for my part, this is more of a modern cultural sort of observation and or criticism. Actually, I think a lot of people want their cake and eat it when it comes to their sense of, more broadly speaking, sort of Celtic Christianity. This idea that you can sneak in a little bit of something spicy, whether
No, Mark.
that's
Celtic Christianity never existed. No. If you start saying that, I'm going to say everything's ritual. You know,
No,
we
no,
don't
no,
do
no, no,
that.
no, no, no. But but this is the way. If you go, for example, to Lindisfarne today, if you speak to lots of people in church communities, they will talk about thin places. They will describe how certain ways of praying is Celtic Christianity, and in very similar conversations, they'll talk about how things like, excuse me, Cuthbert's Cross was a threshold symbol that meant you could walk, between worlds. And it's all very romantic and it's all very lovely.
It's all very Victorian too.
It's all very Victorian. But ultimately, I think about it in the same way that I think about seeing concrete cast Buddhas in your local B&Q's DIY store garden area. The people who buy those Buddhas and take them home aren't Buddhists necessarily. In fact, they almost certainly aren't. But there's something about the aesthetic that they find pleasing, and there's something that they want to have in their lives. And if it brings something positive to their lives, so be it. If they feel peaceful, that's fine. They don't have to believe in the tenets of Buddhism.
Speaking of which, who was buried in the Oseberg ship? And can you talk about the Buddha bucket? That's obviously not the Buddha.
I've been talking for a while. Go on, Howard.
Okay, so the Oseberg ship is one of the most wealthy and famous burials from the Viking world. It was found in Vestfold in Norway, and it's part of a really key wealthy settlement zone that may have been a key locus of royal, incipient royal and aristocratic and royal power. It's really amazing find. It's been published in fragments because it's such a big, and much of it still hasn't been published. For me, the Oseberg ship does deserve a cautious, as with all the early medieval graves, that we call it princely or royal. We could see two osteologically sex estimated females were buried in it. There's been a debate about whether, well, that can't be for them. There must have been a third body that's missing, and it must have been a man. There's been a debate there by Fedor Andreshchuk of the Ukrainian archaeologist who's did expert work on swords and so on in the Viking world. But I think the consensus is that's bullshit, and it's just a way of just desperately taking any powerful grave away from women. I think we are looking at one of those two individuals is likely to be the highest echelon of 9th century society in early medieval Scandinavia, and therefore calling it a queen's burial is not certain, but isn't an outrageous thing to suggest. Whether the power and status they had was rhetorical and aspirational and that of a kin to try and implant a dynasty that was still fragile, as is often debated with other great wealthy graves. Is it about what people wanted their descendants to be rather than what they were? Is, I think, a valid point of contention. This isn't necessarily their stuff and their stuff alone. And, as is often the debate in archaeology, rich graves often are done at times of crisis and uncertainty to try and make a point, to try and emphasize security that didn't exist. And we can see that funerals, deaths of powerful people are moments of crisis, but in terms of, you amp up the wealth at a time where you really need to make sure that their descendants and the kin group have some statement that's public and memorable, and also the monument itself, it remains a place in the landscape. And one of the reasons why we think whether it was that or became that is the fact that it was ransacked over 100 years after. I can't remember the exact dates, but the radiocarbon dating of the shovels that were found in the robbing of the grave, because while so much survived, a lot of things were robbed, because this was a great, in the Viking Age, may have been, as Jan Bill and colleagues have argued, a late 10th century Danish attempt to literally symbolically, like pulling down a Saddam Hussein statue, you are literally symbolically knocking out the ancestral graves of local dynasties in areas that the Danish kings were trying to use their local allies or themselves to take over. So this mound, whether this mound was of a king or a queen and a dynasty, or it became seen as such, it was a story that 100 years after, 125, 30 years afterwards, people was powerful enough that people robbed it with political motivations, not just to get loot, but to perhaps take away and desecrate the grave, so that its power, its charged power as a monument in the landscape, is diminished or destroyed. So it's desecrated, in other words. And so I think it's a really amazing monument for its building, its construction in the early 9th century. But then 150 years later, I think it's more 150 years later, it's taken out of the game, so to speak. It's as a local symbol of power and the memories associated with it, or at least they attempt to, by robbers systematically breaking into it, which was a major endeavor. You can't just secretly sneak into a burial mound, unlike what the thief in the Old English poem Beowulf tries to do with the dragon. You really have to do systematic large-scale earth moving to get into these mounds. So it would have been a weeks-long occupation.
Yeah, they didn't have diggers like we do today.
Yeah,
They didn't have,
yeah,
dump
yeah.
trucks and things.
So this would have been you couldn't have done this in secret. This would have been a major moment for that landscape and the people living in it, seeing the shame or ignominy of seeing that barrow, ransacked, and not being able to intervene, suggests a real shift of power relationships. Or if you want to make it about local people did, for whatever reasons, decided that was no longer the thing. You could make up a Christian motive for it and imagine some, like a lot of the Last film I saw had a Athelstan pulling down the devil's stones because they're a Christian, they're pagan, pull that and make the king of the Cumbrians watch because it was his ancestors that did it. I love that. That's ludicrous. But you can make it about Christians trying to pull down the devil's, but I think it's more likely to be a political gesture by societies that agree that wealthy graves beneath barrows were powerful, enduring symbols of hierarchy, ancestry, and identity.
Kind of like the way that I mean, you compared it to something like attacking a statue, but I guess the consensus aspect is more similar to the way that things like Soviet statuary were moved to particular places, weren't they, in former Soviet cities? So you have this sense of we don't do this anymore, or in that case, we don't respect this person or the story around this place anymore. So we're going to permit this, essentially, as you say, a big undertaking of getting in there and taking something symbolic or otherwise. But I mean, I suppose what you're underlining there, and this is something no doubt you say more or less day one to everyone that you teach, and that is that burials are not for the dead; they're for the living. They're for living people to observe, either to comfort them, or, as you say, to make a statement, or to use later on in some other gesture about what people now think.
It's it's actually Viking Age archaeology is one of the last gasp bolt holes of the unashamed believers in the archaeological world that the dead were buried with personal possessions. And I'm still shocked to find, particularly Scandinavian archaeologists, even as recently as the BJ581 discovery of 2017, still peddling that nonsense, that we are looking at snapshot moments where people were given, what did he want? Well, he liked this sword. And I'm still alive, shut up, I never liked it, be quiet, the Monty Python stuff. But they actually believe these are objects that are of that person, that they're dressing the person with their Sunday best, and that or they actually just fell over into the grave.
Speaking of which, though, unfortunately, now I'm kind of sorry to ask this question. is who was interred in the Pritwell Anglo-Saxon princely burial? Why is he buried with Christian imagery before St. Augustine was supposedly have thought to brought Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons?
Yeah, this is a really great question. You,
Thanks,
Mark?
it's mine, Howard.
And you can keep it.
Yeah, I write them all myself. To be honest, I am not. I know of it, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. So you go ahead, Howard.
Okay, so you get a 0. Can I just confirm that? You've got a
Yeah,
0.
I get a 0. Yeah. Well, I don't.
Yes, I'm
You
ahead.
can't.
No, no.
Well, you can't get a 0. You can't get a 0. You know, unless you. I mean, I could write down 0 if you want, if that makes you
You're
feel
the
better.
scorekeeper.
Yeah, but I mean, like, you can't add nothing.
Oh, I
I thought you were
believe
doing
you.
tallies. I thought you were doing a long list of.
Yeah, he's doing
Yeah.
tally.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so the Prittlewell Prince is an amazing discovery. Museum of London Archaeological Services, ahead of road construction, unexpected find, a well-known cemetery. Thank you. Well-known cemetery in Prittlewell, just outside Southend-on-Sea in Essex. They knew the cemetery from the 19th century due to railway construction, finding a big late 5th, 6th century cemetery. So it was known to be a site where there were furnished burials, mainly inhumations with different items of weaponry and clothing. So we knew there was a cemetery there, but they didn't expect to literally find in the small section they were excavating a chamber burial, because these are a rare, short-lived phenomenon of the late 6th and early 7th century in England, best known of which is Sutton Hoo, multiple burials at Sutton Hoo, but most often found in isolation, like one. But the Prittlewell chamber grave was found as part of a community cemetery that may have been generations old. And whoever was buried there was buried, the investment in that grave was phenomenal. They sunk a chamber and furnished it with not only feasting gear, but home furnishings, including a folding stool, and weaponry. So there's a masculine associations, male gendered, if you like. I don't know, there's different terms you could use to make that point that gender isn't sex and sex isn't gender, but associated with a martial world. And there was probably a burial mound over the top, but that's long been leveled and lost over the centuries. So it's probably marked by a burial mound, and we don't know exactly how big, but there's been estimates. So it's a very wealthy grave, and it at one level it's one of those graves where we go, oh, it's burial with grave goods, like the later Ossenberg ship or Sutton Hoo. They must be pagan possessions so they can go off to the afterlife. But of course, there are Christian associations in the grave, and one of the distinctive Christian iconographic elements is gold foil crosses that may have been placed over the face or eyes of the deceased, and shows it's really important because it not only shows Christian influence, and really important because the grave has now been dated before the mission, the official Christianization of the kingdom of Kent and then subsequently Essex, to the far, I think, I can't remember exactly now, it's the last decade or the second to last decade of the 580s, 590s, if I remember. So it's pre-official Christian conversion. And these crosses, not only gold, they're high status, but they're showing connections with parts of southwest Germany where we have other burials with this tradition. So it shows that the elite of this pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdom that's coming to formation, the East Saxons in the late 6th century, had, as you'd expect, with their neighbours, long-distance trading contacts. They were exposed to the Frankish kingdoms, which were Christian already by about a century, but they hadn't formally converted to Christianity. And it therefore brings up all these questions about if the aristocracy are just trying to look a bit Christian or trying to bury their dead a bit Christian, why? Is it just a superficial window dressing? Or are we looking at societies that actually there's no such thing as pagan, there's no such thing as Christian, they're making it up as they go along, experimenting with funerary traditions, and drawing a lot of continental practice. Our association and obsession is that these Anglo-Saxons migrated in a single generation or two in the early mid 5th century and stayed pagan for 100 years, and then suddenly, oh, I've heard of this Christianity. Have you heard of this Christianity? Well, there's another come off a boat. I'm not having that. And this kind of like, it's part of our colonial contact moment narratives that we have many actually in Britain. These the Romans suddenly arrive in the, and then the Saxons invade, and we still have this contact invasion discourse, which plays into our anti-immigrant discourse about small boats. It's an invasion, and so this idea is about the 5th century. I'm going off on a random rant, aren't I? But it also affects how we think about these greys in the late 6th, early 7th century. These princely greys. Of course, they had contact with Christianity, for crying out loud. They were literally living a day and a half or 2 days row across the channel from a Christian kingdom that's been established, for a century. So why would they not? And so the question is, what's going on with this elite burial? Were they Christian? Were they a king of the East Saxons? Were they, and if so, were they a pagan king or a Christian king, or were they somewhere in bit of this, bit of that, bit of the other? We don't know for sure the identity, but I think we have to see it as a highest echelons of society, exposed to long distance ideas and cultural contacts across officially pagan worlds and Christian worlds. And the other thing, kind of as a footnote, I would add is that the Valerie Fenwick reinterpretation of the Mound 1 ship burial that was published in the Antiquities Journal last year, or was it early this year? Early this year, really blows the lid on some exciting new Christian Merovingian funerary traditions that may have actually played out in that burial. And I can't go into all of them here, but if we are to believe it, they were mummifying the body and embalming it, to be more precise, and using bitumen from the Eastern Med. And
Ooh, cancerous. Amazing.
This isn't to do with maintaining the ship, but this was actually about makeshift embalming practices, as the Merovingian kings were doing, and maybe the East Angles, the neighbours of the Picklewell princes, East Saxon kingdom, were also experimenting in kind of continental ways of dealing with the dead. So rather than some Germanic, Scandinavian, pagan world, they were actually really in a fully fluid world of Christian pagan kingdoms, all experimenting and playing off against each other. Fun times, fun issues.
You mean
Fantastic.
just like people today?
Oh,
No, Mark, how dare you suggest that?
No, but it's interesting. Actually, that bitumen and mummification idea is interesting because it's something obviously that later on popes would be interested in, and there was I think it's less current, less literal today, but there was a strong idea, wasn't there, in the medieval Roman Church that the incorruption of the body, not rotting, was not only preferable because it meant you'd have a better body in the in the new heaven and new earth, that rapture, people popping up out of the ground, but also as well it was a sign of your moral status in life. So going back to St. Cuthbert, when they went to collect his bones to put in an ossuary in a bone box, as was tradition, after a short period of time, well, a long enough period of time, he was found to be uncorrupted. So he was therefore, you couldn't part him out, you couldn't take his fingers off, and give them to other churches. But also, it was a sign that he was somehow not quite of this world. He was, holy.
Yeah,
So
it is important to remember that the idea of the rapture is a Victorian invention, though.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay, but because there were various demonstrations of what bodily resurrection meant to Christians at different times, I think, and one of the things that's interesting in that context is this idea. I wonder whether, because obviously I think there's an element of that today in the US, isn't there, in the funerary industry, when you look at Ask a Mortician's YouTube channel. She really examines this standard for embalming, and I often find myself wondering, because it seems to be tied in its origins, in this idea of having a body that's respected, and therefore might be able to somehow be used in whatever in at the end of times. And even today, politicians in certain states will say, "We respect our dead. That's why we're not going to, we're not going to cremate them or whatever." But I always wonder, would you, if you were that king, or if you're one of these people who's been embalmed, would you thank someone if you came back and you just
Yeah,
like filled
exactly.
with
Absolutely.
fluid? Like, you know,
If somebody if somebody didn't
like a
create me and
hole
like
there.
I
Just,
showed up and like I was all juicy, be like,
yeah.
why did you do this
What
to
did you
me?
do? Yeah, exactly.
So next question. What are the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon clawbeakers for?
Oh, I don't know. Interesting. Is that another zero, Howard?
You took the words right out of my mouth, right? Claw beakers are really interesting. Their origin as late Roman
We see the
feasting.
violence inherent in the system. This is how you get your professor. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Nice muck over here.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, claw beakers, right? So they're derived from late Roman feasting ware of the Rhineland, and their style gets so reduced. They look sci-fi. They look like
Yeah.
something that should have been in the original series of Star Trek,
Hmm.
and probably were. Actually, I don't know. But my point is, they are basically beakers of glass. They would have been high status. They are for drinking from, and presumably, although we now have more evidence of wine in Anglo-Saxon England than previously, ale, mead, they could have been used for a range of beverages. But the point is, they have distinctive sort of side claws which collect the drink in them, which does mean that, as well as just a very striking form of high status drinking apparatus, they also encourage particular styles of holding and drinking, like other vessels that you cannot put down or you have to balance in a particular way. They encourage, they imply, their form implies a drinking culture where the upending of the vessel is an integral part of the drinking. Whether fast drinking or slow drinking, you can see, and it's very difficult to drink it all away. And so it's firstly it's fun to hold and watch the drink slosh between the bits of the claws, but also it serves as a visual way, a very prominent way, where you can see whether someone still has, unlike a horn, it's very clear you can see whether someone's still got a tiniest bit left in. So if you want to poison someone in the early Middle Ages, come on, drink up. I can see there's still stuff in there. No, much more likely it's about drinking etiquette, and we can only guess, but it probably relates to styles of drinking, public, feasting contexts, and therefore they became very popular in Kent and in other parts of the Anglo-Saxon world. But also, with the most fartherly north ones we have are from Valsieda in Sweden, were boat graves, and so they are exported out and emulated in Anglo-Saxon England, and then some of the more prestigious ones even make it up to southern Scandinavia and central Scandinavia. So yeah, they're very cool. I have a replica one which I occasionally quaff from. You don't drink from these things, you quaff, and that's still more. And it's an asterisk thing, isn't it? You have to quaff. But my point is, they are really distinctive, visible ways of drinking that may have been connected to particular local traditions of feasting. That's as far as I can think of.
Here's a harder
Okay.
question. What are the three conical silver mounts covered with Pictish symbols from the Ninian Isle treasure?
Oh, yes, I know this, but go on, Mark.
I don't know it. I
don't know either. So you can give me a
I'll
zero
add a
too, Mark.
zero. Yeah, okay.
I don't know what these three, they're for those who don't know, they are three very specific small conical mounts, but they're very highly detailed.
Right.
Well,
Interesting.
I'm second guessing myself now. I was going to say these, you're referring to the sword chapes that may have been from Pictish silverwork and swords. So this is a probably very early Viking Age deposition in a chapel for protection of very late Pictish period silver. And you have a range of really amazing objects. But I'm second guessing. They're not sword. They're something to do with swords, and if they're not sword pommels, they're sword shapes. I can't remember which bits you may be referring to as conical.
No, that's
but
they're three sort of like they're three they call them mounds, really. I mean, they
Yeah.
were discovered in the late 1950s in the Shetland
Yeah.
Islands. Yeah, exactly. and they date to. That's exactly for
Yeah,
those
those
who
guys.
can't see. Mark is showing
Yeah,
it,
so
and they're
they weren't what I was thinking of. I don't think they're the sword shapes for the scabbards,
Mm.
but they are. I would get as a guess they must be something to do with high status aristocratic bling, and my best guess would be something to do with there would be sword pommels, but I don't know. I'll have to check. I can't remember.
They look like
Give me
medieval Madonna
half a mark.
boobs.
yeah.
Give me no marks for that. Yeah, then Madonna was there voguing away in the Shetlands.
The tassels have somehow rotted away
Yeah, well, this happens. All
Yeah.
tassels
all
rot
the
away.
time.
It is an
Ca-
inevitable part of the
Now
nature of
there's a
the record.
paper. How many tassels have we lost?
oh,
Millions.
Yeah,
countless.
yeah, millions.
But they're all in our hearts, Mark.
Now they are. I'd never thought about it before, but now they're. Now I can't look at the early Middle Ages without thinking tassels on various
Yeah,
parts
yeah.
of bodies.
Well,
Now you've ruined my life.
yes, finally. Can you please speak a bit about the Kivik King's grave? Who is buried there, and what does it have to do with wolves?
Oh, are you referring to the Bronze Age chamber burial in Sweden?
That's a Bredoror, I think that's what it is. That's where it is.
I visited it, and it is a late Bronze Age kist grave in a massive, huge cairn. It dates way before my period. I visited. It's amazing rock paintings. Well, rock art on it on the inside, depicting various ceremonial. In other words, we haven't got a bloody clue. We got
Say the word,
ceremonial
Howard. Say the
things.
word. You know you want to say it.
Ritual. Ritual. I can't remember the wolf connection at all, though. I'm sorry. I remember there's processions of weird figures.
There's some academic study about
Zero.
zero. There's some academic study that's been done about the
Half a
figures and about
0.5. Yeah. So go on.
and
I've heard of him. I've
there
been there.
was a paper that was done about the figures that about it like possibly being a very early depiction of werewolves, etc. But we don't know. It's all
Oh.
speculation. It's speculation.
Okay, I must admit I didn't know that, so maybe I should get 0 because that was a specific question you were asking.
Here's another 0 for you, Howard. Do
Okay.
you think the carved stone balls found at Orkney are related to the Roman dodecahedrons? If not, what do you think the Orkney balls were for? Why is the ball from Towie so special?
How many questions are there? 3. Okay, so the
1
the
point.
the carved stone balls are of unknown form and an unknown function. They've been seen as ritual in some way, and therefore they must be so. Likewise, since we don't know if they're related to the Roman dodecahedrons because no one knows what they're about. So if you
Oh
want
no,
to say,
we figured that out, Howard. They're for pasta portions.
okay, in that sense, yes, they are all about pasta. The whole of it's all about proto pasta. Yeah, so both
When the moon hits your eye, that's a ball, eh? Yeah.
we're into the realms of hyper speculation or uber speculation now, but I would say they're definitely related. They're all stuff we don't know, and that's how they're related. But I don't know about the special one. I don't remember which one's so special.
It's quite large, and it's just very highly detailed. It's very highly carved, and it doesn't look exactly like the others. And for some reason,
Well,
it's don't know.
Well, then it's obvious what that one is. That is the keystone, and it contains it. Basically, if you get that one, then you can finally destroy the Dark Lord, whose name cannot be farted, and allows you, to begin your quest.
It actually plugs the farts. That's the thing.
Yes.
Please write an academic paper on this.
So, but you have to collect the rest before.
Yeah.
But that's the final. That's the final confrontation one. Yeah.
Well, when you take the Towie ball, if you shake it, suddenly all the Roman dodecahedrons, like the end of Iron Giant, they all start.
They become a mech. Oh, that's
they all
so
start
cool.
rolling towards you, and
God.
they build up into this mech. Yeah.
It's like Transformers.
Yeah. Okay. Although, interestingly, it reminds me of not all that, obviously, that nonsense, but the balls and the speculation reminds me of a visit to the Roald Dahl Museum in his hometown.
Hmm.
They have his office his writing room that used to be in a shed at the back of his garden. It's sort of perfectly preserved in there. And one of the things that's in his shed that he worked on for many years, very patiently, in fact, was this thing that you often see people discovering in a Japanese cultural context, and that is mashing together tin foil, or in his case, sweet wrappers, into a perfect ball, and then just polishing it and polishing it and polishing it. Now, out of that comes this wondrous object. But it's done so carefully and intricately because in his case, it was done on the train to London and back. He was bored, so he just sort
See
of
what
made
happens
this
when you don't
thing.
have phones, kids? You
No,
just
exactly.
you got to
And so,
smooth the Tunnock's tea cakes, right?
I mash
Yeah.
all my old phones into a perfect ball.
yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. It's like, oh, I've beaten angry birds. I'm going to now mash my phones together. But in that case, maybe an intricate stone ball is something it's not maybe not as specific as I'm bored, but it's something that you notice a stone is roughly circular, and then you start
Yeah, I
to wet
completely agree
polish
with
it.
you, Howard. I
Yeah.
really do think it really is just an Orkney fidget spinner. I
Yeah,
do
it's
agree. Yeah.
Orkney stimming, for
Yeah.
the ASD
Yeah.
nearly.
So speaking of balls, Irish history and legend, the brain balls, the Irodíochine, are small stone-like balls claimed to have been made from heads or brains of enemies. We have some supported examples from Conwell's discovery of the tomb in Olive. Do you think they're real?
Never heard of these. Sorry.
Oh, zero!
Yes. Fucking yes. Okay. No.
Hey, you haven't got a point yet.
I actually, you might have a point here. I haven't heard of them either, technically, so I'll give you a point,
Ah,
Michelle. However, what I would say is I'm going to say probably not real.
yeah.
Just because of where they're found and what they purport to
So
be.
basically, an archaeologist has done an antiquarian did a dig at a site, a Neolithic site, and found
Yeah.
things linked to Irish mythology, and is going and they're probably just natural stones, right? The natural occurring.
I actually
pebbles.
don't know if the ones that so it's the discovery of the tomb at Olafola, and I actually don't know if they're natural or not. I have no
Well, it
idea.
could be natural and still significant culturally, of course.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm
'Cause-
just I don't know enough about the history of discussion of that. Sorry.
Okay, so let's go back to the Vikings. So how many Viking funerals with the boat actually are there that we know of? Did they really fire arrows
Yeah.
into the boats, or is this Hollywood? Is this
All
made
of
up?
them.
Yeah.
And those that are those that were buried unburnt were those where they were too drunk and they missed. No, we don't. I mean, this is a 1958 film, The Vikings
Yeah.
motif, and I'm going to be talking about that on TikTok and my blog recently because, of course, the final series, thank Odin, of the Vikings spin-off, Vikings
Is that the
Valhalla,
series name?
just aired.
Mhm.
So I thought the series name was Thank Odin. Sorry,
Okay.
I wasn't. That wasn't a joke. I was being serious. Sorry.
No,
Yes,
it's
go on.
called Vikings Valhalla. This is the
Right. Yes.
three
Yeah.
series spin-off of Vikings, and the final episode sees the death. Plot spoiler: Canute dies. And Canute is secretly given by Queen Emma a funeral like a Viking, in which he is set adrift in a longboat off the White Cliffs of Dover, and flaming arrows are fired into his ship.
Oh boy.
Right, but in the real funeral takes place at wherever was Canute buried? Was it Winchester? I presume it was Winchester. I can't remember. But there's a church funeral for him, but in secret. In secret, Queen Emma goes up with one loyal retainer and fires the arrow in the Viking tradition that we literally made up in 1958 to honor his
Yeah.
honor his
Yeah.
So my point is, we're stuck with this obsession with flaming arrows. I wouldn't discount flaming arrows entirely as a military tactic. I think some people, I don't know the military stuff. Military boffins get really excited about these things. I don't, but they were setting fire ships as a strategy of breaking sea barriers, and we have a Hedeby fire ship, or most likely interpretation of a burnt ship in the harbour at Hedeby, which is most likely a ship set on fire to push into others. So, how would they like that? Well, they could have used flaming arrows. I don't think it's ludicrous, but I don't think they were setting alight funeral
I
pyres.
just think, why would you waste an arrow that way?
Exactly.
Well, wait. I mean, come on. Wasting an arrow is one thing, but wasting. So I was once given a king's funeral.
At
Um,
Jorvik?
at Jorvik, yeah. I was one of. It was the 2010 um Viking festival, and I was one of three people who were. It was the Battle of the Three Kings was going to be happening at the end of the thing. And so I spent, of all, of course, the irony is I spent a lot of time painting the shields for my own flipping funeral. So I had to make my own funeral.
Well, would you
Uh,
trust it to somebody else? What if they're
well,
crap
that's
at
true. That's
painting?
true. But I was really quite chuffed because I came up with the shadow and the highlight for the bosses. Oh yeah.
Very nice.
Oh yeah,
Very nice.
arty. Um, anyway, one of our guys, I think his name was Richard, really wanted to be the person who set
Just like the English.
the ship alight. Yeah. um, and what happened was there was this fairly infamous reenactment group called Regia Anglorum, and they were involved with taking the battle to the vision to fruition. And what happened was on the day of, so our guy had been practicing. He was an archer anyway, but he'd been practicing. And Regia Anglorum said this is the language they used, as if they were handing a note to Henry VIII in on a field in France or something. We will not take the field unless our archers light the ship. So what went what was meant to be a really solemn sort of like with a Kim, actually the head of Regia, was, I think he's now long dead, but he was doing the voiceover, he was doing the commentary. That was the other stipulation. So he's like, and here we have the king's men come towards the ship, and sorrowfully they fire a single arrow at the ship, like 20 people, whoosh, and they kept missing it. Just like this, but it was like Helm's Deep. like, and somewhere I've got a friend recorded on their phone footage of it happening. You can just hear me in the background going, well, that wasn't as dignified as I hoped it would be.
You laugh, Mark, but actually on Netflix there is a comedy Viking series called The Norsemen, and that's
Northland!
exactly what they do. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, it's so sad, so sorry, and then
Or have you ever tried to fire an arrow with cold fingers? And they go, yes. And they go, well, it's really difficult.
exactly, yes. And so they end up doing it like 6 times, and they're like, all right, whatever, let's go to lunch. And then
Right,
they just start
interesting.
down and leave.
Yeah, the
Interesting.
best line of that though is where he goes something like, well, it's what he would have wanted. It's like you could justify any balls up by just saying, well, that
Yeah.
was the way it was meant to be. I thought
Yeah.
that was actually, I use that with my students, instructive about funerals and rituals, that there is a lot of unpredictability, and that while it's funny, it actually reveals another universal truth of human nature, is that whatever happens to the dead, whatever goes wrong, the gods intended it to happen.
Yeah.
His left finger was stolen by a seagull or whatever during the cremation, then that's a sign. You can make it up.
Yeah.
So we only have 3 questions left.
Okay.
No way.
Yeah. So this
Only 2 hours. We need to drag this out, Mark.
I mean, we could, but I think it's late for both of you. Do we have any evidence whatsoever of Viking tattoos and braids, or were these accoutrements kept only for high status peoples? Because we've got the combs, but I don't think we have any tattoos still.
I'm just going to say no evidence. But what's interesting is that as actually has been laid out when discussing the Romans in our conversation today, and even to this day, in fact, tattoos are not typically the thing that marks you out as high status. There are places where tattoos mark you out as performing a function, like a warrior, or, for example, in the Roman context, maybe being attached to a legion, or so on and so forth. But this idea of like a facial tattoos. I mean, some of my favorites, some of my favorite reconstructions of the Viking Age, essentially make people look like they're from the 1970s. You know, a bit hairy, but ultimately, you know, dressed a bit like a hippie, in so much as, you know, simple triangular clothing, and not much in the way of what we would consider to be edgy, you know, and let's face it, anti-Christian or anti-modern post-Christian norm culture. You know, the Vikings didn't have something, also the Norse, that these people didn't have something that they were trying to make a point about. And in that sense, I don't see why the obsession with well, I know why the obsession with tattoos took off, and that's mainly because of the Vikings TV series, but also because what it represents now is it's not a subversion, but it's a response to basically what your parents wouldn't have done. You know, it's a cultural response to parental ideas of you know what's decent and proper. You know, how you get a proper job or what you do in church or whatever. People go, well, the Vikings wouldn't have stood up for that, so you know, face tattoo. So I know that's a slightly glib way of answering, but I find it fascinating. And one more thing I'll add to that. I had a friend who sadly he's passed away now. He developed cancer. But when I worked with him, he expressed a desire to be known as a neo-pagan and to be known as honoring and worshipping Thor. And I would sort of joke with him. I'd say, "Well, let me know when you're going to do your next human sacrifice, and I'll come along." And but what's interesting is that he unfortunately, an awful lot of what he did was specifically about opposition. So he loved quotes along the lines of you know, your God asks that you kneel. Mine only asks that I hold a sword or a hammer or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. And you hear this a lot in neo-pagan groups, or especially in sort of Viking reenactment groups, this kind of you know,
Well, it is good that you
self-inflated.
brought it up because you do exactly. So a lot of people will latch on to quotes. And so a
Yes.
lot of these, the thing about tattoos, this comes from what we know about the Rus people,
Mm,
or the braid quote comes from, there's an erroneous thing goes around the internet, and they say something like, oh, the Romans said that their hair was like snakes. That was referring to a specific group of
mm,
Celts, and obviously not the Vikings.
mm,
But a lot of
yeah,
people latch on to that quote
yeah.
thinking, oh, it must have meant so and so, when we don't know that.
No, and also it's pithy and it appeals to what people now are wanting from it, as opposed to what people then would have valued. Howard, so I can see that you've been
No, no,
wanting to
no.
maybe say something.
I'm just thinking about what
Um,
you said.
but the reason why I mention that quote is that I think it goes to the heart of why, you know, the heart, one side of your head shaved, tattoos. Uh,
It looks
it's
cool.
it
It looks
looks,
cool, but it's not historically accurate.
but so is being a punk. You know, in that sense, it's punk. It's not historical.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with punk. I love punk. You know, I obviously I love it. You know, I love having a beard, but I love even having a tattoo. But I don't pretend that these things mean anything more than what they mean in the modern context, I guess. Yeah.
Howard, did you want to add to
Howard?
that?
Yeah.
Because we're down to the last question, which is especially for you.
Okay, well, I was just going to say I've addressed this repeatedly on my TikTok
Yeah.
about the term braids is a bit ambiguous, but I mean, in terms of locked hair traditions, we have no demonstrable evidence that the Vikings had locked hair. I leave people to their own personal choices about how they dress their hair today. My point has never been to criticize or police or comment on those sartorial choices or hirsute choices or whatever about how people dress and present themselves. But my point is, if you claim there's a Viking tradition and therefore white people have a legitimacy to use certain particular protected hairstyles, then that is a dick move. So don't, do what you want with yourself, but don't claim there's other traditions. Now, I've got into a bit of a heated debate, and there's a whole Nordic mythology podcast YouTube video where I talk with Dr. Matthias Nordvig and Daniel Ferrand about that issue, because they interviewed a Icelandic PhD student, Joshua Rood, who is making the argument that there may have been some kind of European and Nordic locked hair tradition. I found those arguments unconvincing. If and when he publishes that thesis or articles from it, maybe the narrative will shift. But for the moment, I think it's the only responsible stance is for me to say that this is not only lacking evidence, but is being manipulated to justify choices that feed into a particular set of cultural appropriative tropes, right? That's the way I framed it. So until that evidence is properly debated, the Vikings didn't have locked hair. Or
Yeah, we just simply do not have evidence for it.
Yeah.
That's it.
But people say, well, they may have done. Well, they might have flown pigs in kilts, but we don't have evidence for it, right? The other point about tattoos and painting is that there may have been a whole series of versatile varieties of different uses of tattoos and face paint and other kinds of painting. And the TV show Vikings is partly to blame for ideas that in ritual and battle context, the Vikings use face paint, face facial tattoos. We have only one reference that may describe tattooing from the Viking world, and that's Ahmad ibn Fadlan talking in his Risala about the Rus. But the Rus are a confederacy of many different cultures and ethnic groups in the Russian river systems, and therefore we cannot be sure, even if he's referring to Scandinavians in his description. But even then, it was tattooed up to the neck, not beyond. So what I said, again, I want to be very clear, I'm not denigrating or dismissing anyone's choice of how they want to do cosplay or how they want to tattoo their own bodies. That's their choice. But if you're going to try and make a claim that this is following a Viking cultural tradition, you're delusional. And again, it's not to dismiss or denigrate people today. It's about challenging the misuse of that narrative to perpetuate a particular representation of the Vikings that is culturally appropriative and white supremacist, because what it's doing is taking specific indigenous designs and claiming they are of a Viking tradition.
Yeah, like chin tattoos specifically.
And my final point about this, which I've said repeatedly and I'll stand by, is we can't blame the TV show Vikings. We have to blame, among others, individuals such as Professor Neil Price, Dr. Gareth Williams, Dr. Peter Pence, and other archaeologists who saw this as a way of debunking in the late noughties and early teens of our century, saw it as a way to debunk old stereotypes of the Vikings by presenting a new biker Viking aesthetic. And it's not and I'm sorry, but the academic community has to take ownership of at least part of the responsibility for this problem. And I'm happy to name those individuals, not to attack them. They're very eminent scholars and they do a lot of good work, but their enthusiasm to popularize the Viking Age, which has done a lot of good, is also, we've got to take on when some of these traits are, people run away with them. I'm not blaming, Gareth and Peter and Neil for everything, any rando in the street locking their hair or
like me.
You're not a random in the street. You're a random with a YouTube channel. You're allowed. No, but I'm seriously. I'm not blaming all of them. But if they've accidentally, I think they've accidentally, largely, unwittingly created this new mythology, which is literally, given the internet, is only a decade deep or 15 years deep, as opposed to the horned helmet trope, which will. So I suspect in 100 years' time, people are still going to have to debunk this. And I said, it's not saying that nobody in the Viking world had tattoos or no one in the Viking age ever put face paint on themselves, but it's become a problem, not because of its presence or absence, because the way it builds on aesthetics that are cultivating a white nationalist and white supremacist discourse. And that's not to blame the academics entirely, but we have to own these problems. We can't say, oh, it's just people who watch TV shows get it wrong, whereas we in our ivory towers, we know best. It's about owning the responsibility for creating these narratives.
And I'll explain this in a second, but that was my point, though. I wasn't saying it's the folks watching it. I'm saying it's no. It's the production, and I see why those decisions were made and what they were emphasizing. Yeah. What they, in many ways, they were successful in emphasizing something that was a little bit alien.
Oh, absolutely.
But they, they've also introduced some other problematic
The
problematic elements.
othering of the Vikings is both dangerous and powerful, and it's good. We showed them as not comfy. This is a world, and that's what the TV show Vikings did so well.
Yeah,
It made us uncomfortable, but
yeah,
also, I'm afraid, for a few people, in the same way people are fine around the baddies in any movie, and you can't say that the whole movie or the whole TV series is white supremacist because some lunatics latch onto a couple of scenes and turn a meme
no,
out of it. But you
yeah,
do have to, you can't deny that that's going on, and we've got
no.
to tackle it
And
rather than just saying, oh, that's a problem for others to deal with.
yeah, and to be fair, there probably needs to be a process of alienating us from the Romans. Actually, I think
Yes.
there really does. But anyway, the reason why I picked up my wizard's pipe is because actually that's the sort of thing that Tolkien introduced into this sort of milieu of Saxon early medieval Arthurian sort of mishmash legend, Norse as well, and Celtic, and I can't tell you how many people I met and I know who do reenacting who wish they could take a pipe to their
Really?
events.
I
Yeah,
never thought about that.
they're desperate to have a pipe, and they'll try and find a way to sort of, I remember someone who was making a pipe out of deer antler, and I was like, don't do that, it'll smell horrible.
Yeah, I
um
know.
he did try it, and it smelled like burnt hair, and it was disgusting.
Oh
um
no.
it was absolutely foul. But the point is, though, is that these, as you say, every generation has their own problems, and in some ways, by 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 Englishifying and making comfortable the world of the Shire, Tolkien introduced this idea that
Yes.
sort of type of literature is tied up with pipe smoking and with tobacco in a way which tattoos maybe arguably today have been um slightly thrown into the mix. So yeah, who knows what the next thing is going to be. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it's just about making sure we don't just blame I wasn't saying you were, Mark. I'm saying this is part of the game. Is we've got to get our
Mm,
hands dirty in these conversations in a metaphorical sense of being aware that we're part of the problem as well as part of the solution when we enter these conversations. So it's not
mm,
about saying debunking is not very helpful if you don't have a narrative to replace it or a story to help people understand the past. If you say, no, they didn't do that, no horned helmets, no, no, no. Well, I never said they were, but I think you might have been looking like you could have been saying they did, and therefore I'm going to shout at you. That doesn't
yeah.
help anyone. And so it's important. I do some pushback videos. I do some countering dangerous misinformation, but sometimes a gentler touch is necessary. But when
Mm,
we've created this mess out of the Fear Cat Sears grave and a bit of lead compound that's found in one of the brooches, which is probably solder, or in America they call it solder. I don't know if in Canada they call it solder, but anyway,
Solder. Yeah.
yeah.
but it's a reused Gotlandic box brooch. And one idea was speculated this is white face paint that was kept in this reused box brooch as like kind of cosmetic. And most people say no, it's probably just solder. But before we know it, this is the narrative that everyone's got white face paint, and it's like because this one idea. And I'm not saying that that was an outrageously dumb idea. I'm just
Mm,
saying that we don't think it's just one possible interpretation that's now largely, I understand, not entertained. But only a decade later, everyone's in the TV shows wearing white face paint when they're doing
mm.
rituals because
Here,
that's
Howard, I'll
what
do
they
it for
do.
you. Ready? It was an outrageously dumb idea. We're almost out of time, so let's do the last question. Howard, this is specifically for you. What is Offa's Dyke and why is it so important to modern archaeology?
I'm glad you asked.
You know why it's so important to modern archaeology? Because at one end of it is the town where I come from. That's why. Thank you.
Wow. Well, there's a obviously it may be
Good night.
contention about whether Offa's Dyke went to Prestatyn or not, but let's
Yeah,
not get
yeah.
into that.
No,
But
no,
the
no, no.
Offa's Dyke is important because it's one of two major linear earthworks in Western Britain that were built seemingly in one or multiple stages. There's still a debate. I've know of dates. I know of OSL dates that haven't been published yet, so I've got to be careful what I say. Watts Dyke, which is shorter and runs about 63 kilometers, and Offa's Dyke, which is over 140. Oh God, miles and kilometers. I got my brain. I can't remember, but it's a bloody long monument anyway. And And both monuments are prehistoric in the sense that we don't have primary records for them. Offa's Dyke is mentioned a century later by Asser in his biography of Alfred the Great, saying that there was an ancient king or an old king, a tyrant called Offa, who built a wall from sea to sea against the Welsh. So it's seen as a wall against the Welsh. There may even be a pun play on words there, but let's not go there. The point is, you have this monument that is remembered as being built by King Offa in the late 8th century, and we have this other monument called Wat's Dyke, and who Wat is a massive who was what is a major point of debate, and it may be a legendary figure, it may be or not, or it may be a historical figure, but either way we're not sure. But the Wat's Dyke, they run parallel in the northern sections, then Offa's Dyke goes further south, and what they're doing, and I've published 2 recent peer-reviewed articles about this in my own open access journal, Offa's Dyke Journal, that they are basically large pieces of frontier works and hydraulic management or control. They're controlling the river routes and the land routes that connect the river systems, the catchment systems of the major rivers of Western Britain, and therefore they're serving as control zones for the western frontier of Mercia. And they're about land grabbing and land holding, but then also dominating lands to their west. So they're military works, but they're also territorial, economic, and political, and probably also social, in the sense they're dividing up and creating an entire landscape, a new way of thinking about the landscape. And Keith Ray and Ian Baptist's 2016 book goes into much more of an expanded argument at Offa's Dyke. But both monuments, we don't know which was first and which was second, are really fascinating examples of large-scale engineering projects to control the landscape and movement through it in peace and war. We don't know how long they were extant. It may have been only they were used for a generation apiece, and one may have succeeded the other. But the point is, they are fascinating examples of the scale of mobilization of resources that these kingdoms were able to draw upon at a time that as the same time as the Frank's casket in many ways, a time when Britain was fragmented into kingdoms, a British speaking, a Welsh speaking and English speaking, Old English speaking, and were vying for power. And in certain instances, at certain moments, major engineering projects of dike building, of that bank and ditch building were seen as solutions to articulate power relationships. And so I think it's there's so much we don't know about Offa's Dyke, but it's important because it's one of the many strands of evidence that tells us about these early medieval peoples and kingdoms. That's my short answer. But they're wonderful. I do a lot of TikTok videos going up and down them because they're almost too big to be comprehended. They're too big to capture in your mind's eye. So you can only really get a sense of their scale by walking them or cycling around them.
So Mark, what's go ahead.
So apparently the monument is 150 miles, 240 kilometers.
240 kilometers.
And the total length of the path is 177 miles. So there's a good 27 miles difference.
My doctoral researcher, Lena Delaney, is pursuing ongoing LiDAR research, which has found whole new sections of the monument we thought were invisible. And so basically, they've published their work in Offa's Dyke Journal 3, a preliminary study of some sections, and she's traced it across the Y, from the Y to north to Rushwick Hill, which was a section where even a decade ago people were saying, "Oh, it's not there," and she found it basically. And so it's you think, how can you find an entire stretches of monument in the English landscape? Surely everyone's looked before. And it shows how, while we've got a very intensive research landscape, this monument, where it goes, what it was for, is still ongoing. And like Stonehenge and any other major monument you could care to think of, new research brings new questions.
I won't mention the recent I'm sorry, I won't mention it, but I will mention it. I won't mention the recent archaeology discovery for Stonehenge, because I love the way it's being framed is like, oh, Scotland has a claim to that. Scotland didn't exist at the time.
No, exactly.
And neither did England, neither did Wales. It's just anyway. So
people want it. They want a piece of the action, don't they?
Yeah.
It belongs to the whole island anyway. The divisions of countries did not exist in Neolithic times.
It's like everyone wants St. Patrick. That's what it is.
Well, St. Patrick built Stonehenge as well as Offa's Dyke.
Yeah. Yeah. He had a JCB.
So Mark, how did everybody do?
Well, technically speaking, I've written the scores down here.
What's that?
I
Oh, a bit
well,
faster, please. What? A bit slower.
You see, you have scored 9.5 plus 0 and a quaff for quaffing.
Oh,
Yes. I've scored 6 plus 3 zeros, unfortunately,
which
and
counts as 3 marks, really, actually. So really, we're a tie.
yeah, and then Michelle has scored 1, which flipped is 10. So
That's
I
true.
mean, who knows? Who knows who's won?
Well done, Michelle. You did brilliantly.
The
You
real
won.
winner is the people watching.
The real winner is you, Howard, because you get the gift of further reading, which happens to be
Yay!
your own books.
Hooray!
So the gift of further reading this time is The Death and Memory of Early Medieval Britain by, of course, Professor and Archaeologist Howard Williams, TM. Would you please show the book? Very good. There is the book. The book.
The book.
And also Cremation and the Archaeology of Death by Professor Howard
I
Williams.
don't have that here, actually, but yeah. Cremation, the Archaeology of Death.
Yep.
Fine,
He
then don't
burned
read
it.
that one. No. And Mortuary Practices and the Social Identities in the
Middle Ages.
Middle Ages by
Duncan Sayre and Howard Williams.
Fantastic.
There's all your further reading. I hope you had a good time, Howard, and I
loved it. Thank you so much.
I hope you'll come back and we'll do this again
Course.
sometime.
Of course, I'll have to do some swatting next time. I feel poorly prepared for the Bronze Age and Neolithic sections of the quiz.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.